everybody. I'm very happy to be here. So my name is Etienne. My employer, Shopify, has been graceful enough to allow me time and expenses to come here and visit you, so I'm very happy about this. Today I'm going to be talking about mixed reality for social good, as in this nice slide here. So it's a little story that starts in 2009. I had a very nice job as a Java backend dev back then. I'd gotten a bit bored with the work, and so I started developing on Android as a hobby. So I was looking for ways to get better at it and maybe turn it into a career. So that's when I started attending my local Android developers group. So that's in Montreal, Canada, for those who don't know where that is. We're like 5 hours north of New York. So communities are very cool for a lot of reasons. They're really magical, right? You go in, you meet new people, you come up with crazy ambitious ideas. Sometimes you try to build them at hackathons. Once in a while, you succeed. You just end up learning a ton of cool new stuff. So before long, I became a very active member of this community. I was giving talks, I was volunteering in workshops, I even organized some hackathons, a lot of fun. And a couple of years ago, I joined something called Osmos Academy. So Osmos is a nonprofit that was funded by some good friends in our Montreal community. I met them at a hackathon called Wear Hacks. So this hackathon, as you might guess, is based around wearable technology. So I attended Wear Hacks with a bunch of friends. Our big idea then was to experiment with wearables and see if we could use them as input devices for VR experiences. Back then, we were talking Google Cardboard, so we had some limited success there. We did have a lot of fun and learned a ton of new things. But this interest that we had in wearables and VR carried over when we started volunteering with Osmos. So the general idea behind Osmos is to teach social-minded volunteers about emerging technology. So we put a strong emphasis on improving accessibility to these emerging technologies. The charter you see here also emphasizes 3 core values. Those are engagement, inclusion, and diversity. So that creates a powerful mix that attracts volunteers from all walks of life. So we're getting here people that are super motivated to learn and motivated to make a difference in the community. So when we started Osmos, the question came up, okay, so we love VR, we love AR, we're really big into wearables, and IoT is pretty cool too. How can we do something fun with all of this, but also build social good with that technology? So we started looking at direct applications of VR. VR can be an awesome learning tool, for example. So if you think about geography, the VR edition of Google Earth is a great example. So what could be a super boring subject for some is turned into an eye-opening exploration of the world, right? You're a giant looking over these incredible vistas and awesome places all over the planet. You can teleport yourself. It's like being Superman going into orbit and flying back down. Like really, really cool. Imagine for a second you want to create a time machine to explore historical events. So this is an installation that you can find at the Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw. So if you think about VR, you can build any type of simulation. You could navigate to the heart of the atom. You could see math equations come to life. You could be standing inside a running engine. The possibilities are really endless there, right? And there could actually be a lot more learning benefits to presenting material in such an immersive way. So this is a link to an article by Chris Nicholson. He's a researcher on Shopify's VR team. Slight disclaimer, I'm not part of the VR team, I'm part of the Android team, but I really admire their work. They do a lot of very interesting stuff in the space. So in this article, he explains that humans are visual and spatial learners. So to illustrate this for yourself, try to think back to your high school days, right? I'm betting it's kind of difficult to remember the name of most of your classmates. I guess depending on how old you are. For me, it's really hard. But chances are you can probably draw out of memory a roughly accurate floor plan of your school, still today. So by creating virtual spaces that you can physically explore, you're going to leverage that effect with your learners. In the field of journalism, we've also seen very compelling uses of VR. So what is life like if you're fleeing from a war zone? Or what is it like if you're a daily, like a volunteer, right, in the far-off region of the world? So finally, we also can see about healthcare. There's been a lot of research in healthcare to see how to use VR and AR for treatment. So things like relaxing patients that are suffering from chronic pain, or exposure therapy to treat phobias. We also have rehabilitation therapy. There's a lot of promising areas of research there. And at Osmos, healthcare is where we first focused our efforts. So we created a project called VR Passports. So that was launched in 2016. The project brings VR into the hospitals for kids undergoing treatment. It's the way for them to escape a bit from their environment, learn about the new technology, and just have, some fun. For these kids, even a small break from the hospital is a really big deal. So in preparation for these hospital visits, what we did is we held various workshops. So we had VR content workshops and courses for our volunteers. So that also attracts volunteers and teaches them something in preparation for the visits. We would teach them back then how to build Google Cardboard VR experiences with the Unity game engine. We also had augmented reality content creation workshops. At the end of all these workshops, we even ran a Project Tango hackathon. So Google sponsored us back then, sent us tablets so that our participants could actually develop on the actual hardware. It was a lot of fun. We also had kid-friendly workshops as part of that series. So there, participants would take Google Cardboard headsets and decorate them. And the thing is, these were actually probably our biggest hit. It might sound silly, but that workshop really inspired me going forward. So I started paying attention to how people got creative when they were at Osmos events. I saw participants from all fields, right? Artists, designers, crafters, developers, cinematographers even, in some cases. So I estimate that a solid third to a half of the people we would get in our workshops were not from a technical background. But at the end of the day, everybody taking part learned something, and more importantly, found a way to contribute. You did not have to be a developer to take part in these workshops, and that is what I thought was one of our biggest strengths to build the community. So where do you go from there, right? How do you take that pool of super enthusiastic volunteers and empower them to do even more? So based on the experiences from that VR Passport project, some ideas came up. One was to provide some sort of toolbox to the community so everybody could learn something new. We wanted to have like a reusable set of tools. So then our question became, well, what kind of project has something for everybody? One example is this Audi mixed reality experiment. Their idea was to build a real-life model out of a sandbox and scan it, and then drop the players in the car into that sandbox. So if you watch this clip, step back a bit and put a community organizer hat on, right? It's really a great project. So kids playing around in a sandbox, you're building a race car rig, 3D modeling, scanning stuff with a Kinect, programming the actual VR simulation. So there's a ton of skill sets required there, and you don't need to be an engineer to participate in a project like that. Another big source of inspiration was this game called Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes. So this game is a co-op game. One of the players is a technician who's in a virtual room with a ticking time bomb that they need to defuse. The other player are experts that have the actual bomb defusing manual. Now, the experts can't see the bomb. The technicians don't have the instruction manual. This game is all about communication between players. I believe that's why it's often called like one of the best VR experiences out there. What's important to point out here is that the concept even works without a VR headset. And the thing is, VR headsets have one big obvious downside. They isolate the viewer from the people around them. When creating a mixed reality experience, you can solve that problem. You can create a shared experience. And that's the kind of experiences we wanted to build at Osmos. So that's where our focus went when we started building that toolbox I mentioned earlier. Mixed reality projects, for me anyway, were all about enabling people to break through that VR fourth wall. That's something that I think is really desirable. So today we're going to talk a little bit about one of the things that we've been putting in our own mixed reality toolbox. One of these is Android Things. So having Android Things in your toolbox allows you to create connected physical models and then interact with them from VR or AR. There we go. For this, Legos are also part of our toolbox. So they allow us to prototype the physical side of the mixed reality experience in a very easy way. Now, the funny thing about Lego as a platform is that you can really go pretty far with it. This is a kit that you can get from a company called Dexter Industries. It allows you to use a Raspberry Pi as the brain of your Lego Mindstorm build. One of the slight downsides to using Legos, though, is cost. Lego Mindstorms are still pretty pricey. There's a few alternatives out there. So there's one also by Lego called WeDo, which are a bit more educational, slightly more affordable, but still pretty pricey. And the connectors between those different Lego sets are actually not compatible. So there's a few downsides there, too. So that's a bit of a hassle. To supplement Legos, what we did is we experimented with 3D printing our own connector parts. 3D printers nowadays are at a level where you can get pretty good results that are actually Lego compatible. If you want to add 3D printing to your own toolbox, Monoprice sells this very decent unit. Like this printer is about $220 US. 3D printing, on the other hand, can be a bit of a time sink when you get started with it. But what's kind of nice about this unit is that that goes away. It's very much plug and play. So I'm not selling it for them or anything. And the little warning is that if you do want something like that, it's usually back ordered. So you have to be patient if you want one. But it's worth the wait. Right, and for AR experimentation in our toolbox, we focused on using phones as magic windows, right? Looking through the phone screen and seeing things being overlaid on a scene. Smartphone with cameras are the norm these days. They're powerful enough to provide pretty good AR if you're using the right libraries. On the VR side of things, Unity has been our go-to for training workshops. What's really great about Unity is how it acts as an abstraction layer. It allows you to write content for Oculus, HTC, HTC's Vive, the Daydream, Google Cardboard. So you can pretty much write experiences that can be used across the board. Right, you might be thinking at this point, oh, at least 3 or 4 platforms here. How do we get them to talk to each other? So for most of our quick MVPs, we've been using Firebase DB. This is not a Firebase DB talk, so we're not going to go into details. But if you're not immediately familiar with what this provides you, here's the general idea. You have one Firebase model that lives in the cloud, that is your one source of truth. And this is an example one where we'd have a player position and a few things like that we're tracking. All the connected devices are both writing into this model and listening to changes to it. So whenever one of the devices writes in, everybody else is notified about it. And the latency is low enough that you can get pretty good experiences, even with VR applications. All right, so we're going to explore a little bit more the Android Things component out of our toolbox. So Android Things supports the Raspberry Pi 3, which is a very popular platform, and that's what originally I went with. But if you do start your own Android Things project tomorrow, I'd recommend you grab this board, the MX7, instead. The main reason is that it's a lot faster to develop with. It's also generally better supported at this point by Google. What's fun with this board is that you can connect to it with a USB-C plug. So that way, when you want to upload your programs into the board, it's very, very quick. On Raspberry Pi, the cycle of development is kind of slow. Whenever the APK goes over, it's kind of long wait. Like in my latest versions of the Raspberry Flash, it's like 4 minutes to deploy, which is intolerable, so that's painfully slow. Anyway, so let's start building an example. Let's say our mixed reality experience, we're going to have players exploring the multiverse, right? We have 2 roles in this sort of simulation. We're going to have explorers who are going to be wearing a VR headset, and we're going to have scientists. And these guys start in a lab. where they will be assisting the dimensional explorers. So in this lab, we're going to have an interdimensional portal. It also features a conveyor belt that you can see there that the scientists will use to send stuff through the portal. And then the people inside that portal can send stuff back through. So if we start with something simple, we're going to add an LED to our physical Lego model. We want to be able to blink the LED and control it whenever, say, our explorers want to send stuff back through the portal. So the electronics for this kind of stuff are really, really simple. By writing into what's called a GPIO pin, you can control the state of the LED on or off. So this is one example of how you could control the pin on the software side. The key idea here is to reference the pin with the Android Things Peripheral Manager service. Then you can turn it off and on just by calling a set value on what you get from that. On this case, the GPIO pin 12, whatever. Like, your models will obviously be different. And if you're familiar with this kind of stuff, you might see I'm using RxJava here to turn the LED on and off. That might be overkill. Your mileage will vary. All right, so to make things more interesting with the model, we can also add mechanical interactions. So in this example, I've used a small DC motor to move the conveyor belt back and forth. Electronics, when you do that kind of stuff, are a bit less trivial. The main reason for that is that you need to isolate the motor from the logic circuit on the power side. The requirements for power there are very different for a little DC motor than those for the Raspberry Pi. By using the component you see here, the L293D chip, you can make sure that turning off and on the engines won't fry the Raspberry Pi right next to it. Anyway, if you want to build your own models, I recommend you look up adafruit.com. They have really great tutorials for simple projects like these. They also have a very nice Raspberry Pi add-on board that you can use to control multiple motors and servos to create more sophisticated things like little robots that you could remote control. On the Android Things side for this specific DC and motor example, this is the code that you can use to turn the motor on or off. So here, PWM stands for pulse width modulation. It's how you control the speed of the motor. GPIO pin 20 and 21 that you can see in the source code here are to control if the engine is going forward or backward. So you flip the booleans around if you want it to go backwards. Now, you might be new to electronics. What's interesting is the Android Things website has you covered with a Hardware 101 section. Like, all the things I'm showing you today and a lot more sophisticated things I've built by knowing basically zero electronics and sort of starting from scratch on the Hardware 101 section. I really recommend you check it out. I found it very helpful anyway. Another very good idea is to get a little Raspberry Pi starter electronics kit. So we got ours from a local electronics hobby store. You can find them a ton of these online. What you want to look for in a good Pi kit is to have a detailed manual and with a lot of varied projects that you can build so that you can learn the basics and you can also teach your volunteers the basics. So at this stage, we've created a Lego model with the basic components for real-world interactions. So let's see how we can augment these little models. So we're going to try to add a basic portal effect in that doorway. And to complete the illusion, we're going to add virtual objects on the conveyor belt as well. My original approach was to use Project Tango. So Project Tango, if you don't know it, is a technology stack that was created by Google. It runs on custom devices that have extra sensors and cameras. This allows the devices to really know where they are in 3D space, and it can also provide like a pretty accurate reading of what's in front of the device. Like you see from your code a point cloud that you can use to sort of detect things in front of you. So that allows you to build pretty impressive AR experiences. While Tango is really awesome, it's definitely not what you can call available hardware or accessible hardware for most people. So for our own workshops, we ended up going with Jérôme and Alexandra's Etienne's 3JS Webb AR Extension. So they've had really great success building AR scenes that render at 60 frames per second, even on 2-year-old Android phones. The library is web and JavaScript based, and this makes the technology accessible to a very wide range of people. So it's really perfect for community projects. I'd like to mention, if you haven't seen it in the program already, that Alexandra and Jérôme are going to be presenting here this afternoon. So if you're curious, I really encourage you to check that out. As a side note, though, if you are interested by Project Tango, I've done a talk on it at DroidCon New York 2016. So that talk can show you how to get started building AR experiences using a magic window on Tango. If you're curious, please come talk to me after the session, and I'll give you more details. Now, the first thing you need when you get ARJS working is a visual marker. So the library uses image recognition on a video feed to find a pattern. Then it's going to anchor your 3D scene on top of the position of that marker. Then in our example, what we need to do is map our virtual model onto the physical one. So the calibration phase involves placing the marker on the model itself. The key here to remember is that the size of the marker determines your scale. So the marker in the virtual space is going to be 1 by 1 unit, in this case laying flat on the X and Z plane. You can see on the frame a 1 by 1 by 1 cube that's sitting right on top of the marker. So ignoring the configuration boilerplate that you're going to get in most examples, this is the code that you need to add the transparent cube to the scene. I've also added an axis helper to this scene, so that helps you to visualize where the X, Y, and Z axes are in space. You see them here in red, green, and blue. So if you're new to 3D, the main thing to remember is that creating a 3D scene in Three.js is actually pretty simple. The library is very well documented. People in our own workshops tend to pick it up pretty quickly. So to map virtual objects onto the video feed, we take real-world Lego measurements and then add them to the simulation. The AR marker I printed for this demo that you could see earlier measured 32 millimeters on each side. So knowing that, this is how you would calculate your virtual Lego measures. And finally, a chunk of code that shows you how to add objects to the scene. I can go quickly over it, but the main idea is to notice that there's one part that adds a red object on the conveyor belt, and another part that adds this semi-transparent portal in the portal window right there. You might see the adjustments are a bit rough. At this stage, what I found is that at that scale, it's been kind of hard to sort of get very precise readings with AR.js, which is like understandable. We're talking about millimeters here, so that's kind of... But I think there's interesting developments. I'm very curious to see when the various AR libraries that Google and Apple are producing are going to be integrated with AR.js. I'm getting the feeling that we're going to get better measurements out of this stuff. All right. So right now we've built a real-world component of our mixed reality prototype. We have like an actual model. We have augmented stuff on top of the model. So let's look at the virtual component and how to build that. So what happens on the other side of the portal? At that point, I was really all out of ideas, so I reached out for help. This is Nina, my creative director. So in this case, we have Mr. Halloween guy that wants to go say hi to his friend Birdie Buddy all the way up in the corner. To say hi to Mr. Birdie Buddy, we're going to need to open 4 doors. Imagine that these white little brick bars are the actual doors here. The person wearing the headset will be playing the role of Mr. Halloween guy. The person outside the simulation will help Mr. Halloween guy when he faces obstacles on the way, for example. Here we're using Google Daydream and the Unity engine to build our VR experience. So in regards to VR in our community, we've had really great success, I think, as I mentioned, using Unity. It opens up the door to developers of all levels. It's pretty easy to pick up, I think. To set up your own copy of Unity for Daydream development, you're going to want to follow the instructions on this site. It's going to get you most of the way there when setting up your environment. The thing to note is that the latest versions of Google VR's Unity SDK is best used with a fresh install of Unity 5.6 and not necessarily the latest copy of Unity. And if you're a day-to-day Android developer, there's a couple of issues to be aware of. Now, under the hood, the thing is that Unity's latest version is still expecting an older version of the Android SDK tools. So you're going to want to have separate installs of the Android SDK for Unity than the ones that you would be using in your day-to-day development if you're an Android developer. You just need to grab the appropriate zip for your platform, configure Unity to use that install instead of the one that's usually in the default path. Another issue that you might run into, like I did, is that the Daydream Controller emulator might not work right out of the gate. For this to work, you might want to follow some of the links here and edit one of the one of the CS files that comes with the SDK. The long and short of it is take a snapshot of this if you want, or come see me after and I'll share the links. And you'll have most of the problems fixed, and it will let you skip some of the Googling and troubleshooting. All right. The other recommendation I give to people new to Unity is to use JetBrains C# IDE Writer. Writer has a very nice Unity plugin. You can get all the powerful features you're used to with Android Studio. I would avoid the default Unity IDE if you can. It's not really worth your time. All right. And if it's the first time that you're playing with Unity, spend a bit of time with the Roll a Ball tutorial. This one will teach you all the basics of the world editor. You're going to see how to add 3D objects to a scene. It's going to teach you the basics of camera placement, lighting, materials. You're going to also find out how to add scripts to game objects and how to apply physics. It's an hour really well spent before diving into the Google VR SDK. That said, once you're familiar with Unity, using the Google VR SDK is really straightforward. What you need to do first is to add the GVR Viewer main prefab that you can see here to a Unity scene. Once you have that, that's all you need to get Daydream going. When you preview scenes with Unity, as you can see here, you now have fully stereoscopic 3D. You also get lens distortion, and you can see that you can emulate a user's head movement using the mouse. So now, to use the actual Daydream controller, which is similar to this little remote, you add the GVR controller main prefab to your scene. Then, under the UI prefabs folder, you're going to find the GVR controller pointer, add that thing to your player game object, the thing that represents your point of view in the scene. That prefab is going to add the controller model, the Daydream controller model, to the scene, and we can see it right here. So by having that, you can then install and bring up the controller emulator app on your phone. So when you do that, this will pair with Unity, and what you get is a controller, either a physical one or one emulated on your phone, that you can actually use in your simulation. So for development, that kind of setup is like your best case scenario, right? It allows you to develop things without having to run the apps on the actual phones, which will save you a ton of time. Like without this, it's kind of hard to develop in VR. All right, so if we go back to our little story with Mr. Halloween Guy and Birdie Buddy. We haven't yet put doors in our scene, so again, asking you to use your imagination, but how will we, Mr. Halloween Guy, move across the board to get to our friend? So the baseline locomotion mechanic in most of VR experiences is some form of teleportation. It allows you to avoid the sort of seasickness that you can get in VR. So there's a link right here to a very detailed tutorial on how to implement this in Unity for Daydream. We're going to quickly go over the basics in this talk. The general idea with Unity is that you assign scripts to objects that need to react to clicks. Then, when you use an event trigger component, you can register to interesting events. So here, when the pointer enters and exits a tile, it will trigger a color change. We're going to see it in a second. So you can see that the tile will turn purple, and when you click on the tile, you teleport to it. So now that we have locomotion, we're going to want to add locked doors to that scene. To make things more interesting, I've come up with this scheme in our examples where you have color-coded cubes that represent keys of sorts, and each of the doors need to be opened by the right key, right? So the player needs to hold the cube or the right color to be able to click on the door and open it. So then the player kind of need a way to know what they've picked up, right? Like if you click on the cube, it tells you, okay, I've picked up this object, and then you want to use it on a door, and when that happens, we want the door to open. So how do we go about this? First, you need a way to pick up objects. That's simple enough, right? We want to click and then store a reference to this object when it's clicked in some sort of inventory. That's great, but we're going to want to communicate to the player, oh yeah, you have that on you now. It's part of your inventory. How do we do that? So a quick way to do this is to add a key holder sphere to the scene, right? And we can add a little object that sticks to the controller, and that will be visible to the player in the VR experience. We add a pick key method to the behavior script of our object. Then when that will receive a pointer click event, it's going to trigger a pick key method. Anyway, at the end of the day, what's important is that we need to show the feedback to the users so that they understand what they have in their hand. So when you click on the key, you're going to see the color of the thing that you just picked up. So let's see how that looks in a little demo. Now we can see the pointer. It's kind of a small, you can see the small ball next to the controller. You can also see the highlight when you select a cube, and when the click happens, that little marker changes. So that's tiny in these frames, but you have to remember that the person wearing the headset is going to see this in full frame, so they have a very good visual cue of what they've just picked up. All right, so now we have a key. How do we use it to open a door, and how do we open doors anyway? So Unity has a very nice animation system that's perfect for this kind of thing. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail here, but what you want to do overall is create an animation, that in this case I call door opening. Then by drag and dropping this animation onto the door, the actual object in the scene that you want to animate, it's going to create an animator for that door. And the animator pane that you get when you do this looks like this. So it allows you to add properties and control, in this case, the height of that object in the scene. And then by sort of saying where the height ends up at the end of the animation frame, you can, then everything else is interpolated for you. So not too much trouble right there. All right, so last step really is that you want that animation to trigger on an unlock event. Unity's animators look like this. They allow you to build very complex state machines if you want to. In our case, it's actually super simple. We want an idle state where the door is closed, an open state where the door will be opening, and then finally a closed state where we'll bring the door back down and close it. The way to do this in Unity, to animate in reverse and close down a door, is to actually set your animation speed to -1, which will cause it to reverse. That's a little trick that I had a little bit of hard time finding out at first when I was starting. Anyway, so this is the final result, right? You jump into the simulation, and we're going to see it in action. When the user points to the door and clicks on it, it opens, and then clicks again, closes. Fairly simple stuff. And there you have it. So that covered most of the tools that we teach and use at Osmos right now. Of course, we're always improving on this tool set. We have a lot of ideas and very little time, but it's always fun to look at new ideas. If you're interested in building similar stuff in your own community, or would like to share notes, or would like to participate in sort of building this tool set, I'm really always happy to connect. So please come and see me after the Q&A or the session, and we'll just share contact info and see if we can set up a dialogue. And with that, I would like to say thank you. So I don't know if we're set up for Q&A proper, but I don't see anybody with microphone. So what I suggest we do is just connect after the session. So again, thank you very much for being here.